The teacup shattered on the stone floor before anyone in the room understood why. Edmund Hale, Duke of Ashcombe, did not even look up from the letter in his hand when he said the words that would end everything. His voice was flat, almost bored, the tone of a man discussing the weather. "You're replaceable, Eleanor. I could have a new housekeeper here by morning." Eleanor Marsh stood by the sideboard with a silver tray still balanced on her forearm. For a moment she did not move. The kitchen door behind her was open, and through it came the small, ordinary sounds of a house waking up, water running, a spoon against a pot, someone humming a tune that did not belong to a house about to break apart. Those sounds stopped one by one as the words traveled through the doorway. Margaret Hargrove, who had run this house for 11 years, froze with a basket of bread halfway to the table. Alice Finch, the young upstairs maid, stood in the corridor with an armful of linens pressed against her chest, her mouth slightly open. Even Peter Doyle, who had come in from the stables to ask about a delivery, stood frozen at the back entrance with mud still on his boots. They had all heard it. Eleanor set the tray down. Her hands did not shake, though everyone in the room would later say they expected them to. She untied her apron with slow, deliberate movements, folded it in half, then in half again, and placed it on the back of a chair. "Eleanor," the Duke said, finally glancing up as if noticing for the first time that the room had gone silent. "Sit down. We are not finished." "We are," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it carried the way a struck bell carries, long after the sound should have faded. She did not raise it. She did not need to. The Duke set down his letter. For a man who had just delivered what he believed was a small, forgettable insult, he looked oddly caught off guard by her calm. "Do not be dramatic," he said. "It was a comment, nothing more." "You said I was replaceable," Eleanor answered, "in front of everyone who works in this house, as though I were a broken chair or a burned-out candle." "That is not what I meant." "It is exactly what you meant. You said the words yourself, Your Grace. I do not need to explain them back to you." Mrs. Hargrove set the bread basket down very carefully, as though sudden noise might make the moment worse. Alice had not moved from the corridor. Peter's mud had begun to dry into small flakes on the floor, and still no one told him to clean it. The Duke stood. He was a tall man, used to rooms rearranging themselves around his height and his title, used to servants lowering their eyes before he had finished a sentence. Eleanor did not lower her eyes. "You have worked in this house for 6 years, he said, as though reminding her of a debt. "Where exactly do you intend to go?" "That is no longer your concern." "Everything in this house is my concern." "Then you should have thought of that," Eleanor said, "before you decided I was not part of it." She walked past him, past the long table still holding half of the morning's breakfast, past the window where morning light was falling in long gold bars across the floor. She did not slam the door. She simply opened it, stepped through, and closed it behind her with a quiet, final click that somehow felt louder than any slam could have been. For a moment, nobody in the kitchen moved. Then Mrs. Hargrove untied her own apron. "Margaret," the Duke said, turning toward her with something almost like alarm crossing his face for the first time. "What are you doing?" "The same thing she just did, Your Grace." "You cannot be serious. You have run this household for over a decade." "I did not run it for you," Mrs. Hargrove said, folding her apron the same careful way Eleanor had. "I ran it with her. There is a difference, though I do not expect you to have noticed it." She set the apron beside Eleanor's on the chair, walked to the corridor, and touched Alice gently on the shoulder. "Come, dear, let us pack your things." Alice looked from Mrs. Hargrove to the Duke and back again, her arms still full of linen she did not seem to know what to do with. She was young, barely 18, and this was her first post away from her family's small farm 2 villages over. She had been so proud, 6 months ago, to wear the house's uniform. Now she looked at the fabric folded in her arms as though she had never seen it before. "I do not want any trouble, sir," she said quietly to the Duke. "Then stay," he said. "This is nonsense, a misunderstanding blown out of proportion." "With respect," Alice said, her voice trembling only slightly, "you said it in front of all of us. You did not say it to hurt only her. You said it so we would all hear what she was worth to you, and now we know what we are worth too." She set the linens down on a side table, smoothed the fabric flat out of old habit, and followed Mrs. Hargrove toward the servants' stairs. Peter Doyle was the last to speak. He was 17, broad-shouldered from years of lifting feed sacks and grooming horses twice his size, and he had never in his life spoken a full sentence directly to the Duke. He cleared his throat. "I'll be collecting my wages then, Your Grace, and my things from above the stable." "You are a stable hand," the Duke said, his patience fraying now, his voice rising for the first time. "This does not concern you at all." "It concerns me plenty," Peter said. "Miss Marsh brought soup down to the stable the winter I had the fever. Nobody asked her to. She just did it, same as she did everything else round here, quiet, so nobody would make a fuss over it. I'm not staying in a house that calls a woman like that replaceable." He gave a short nod, more to himself than to the Duke, and walked out through the same door Elinor had used minutes before. The Duke stood alone in the breakfast room, surrounded by cooling tea and untouched bread, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he did not know what to say to an empty room. Outside, on the long gravel drive that curved down through the oaks toward the main road, Elinor Marsh walked without looking back. She had one small case in her hand, packed the night before, though she had not admitted to herself until this morning why she had packed it. Some part of her had known this day was coming for weeks. The Duke's temper had been sharpening lately, his patience thinning like a coat worn too many winters, and lately every small correction, every minor disagreement, seemed to end with him reaching for the sharpest word in the room. She had simply not expected it to happen over breakfast tea in front of the entire staff, delivered so casually, he had not even paused his reading to say it. Behind her she heard footsteps on the gravel. She turned, expecting perhaps Alice or Mrs. Hargrove coming to walk with her partway. Instead she saw all three of them together, Mrs. Hargrove with a small case of her own, Alice still clutching a folded uniform she had not returned, and Peter carrying a canvas bag over one shoulder. "You did not have to do that," Elinor said, though her voice caught slightly on the words. "None of us had to," Mrs. Hargrove said. "We wanted to. He will find new staff by tonight. He said so himself." "Let him try," Peter said, and there was something almost like humor in it, though his jaw was tight. "Word travels faster in this county than his letters do. Every household within 10 miles will know what he said before his lunch is served." They walked together down the long drive, past the gates where the ivy had grown thick over the old stone pillars, past the fields where the morning mist was just beginning to lift. None of them spoke for a while. The only sound was gravel under their shoes and, somewhere far off, a dog barking at nothing in particular. It was Alice who finally broke the silence. "Where will we go?" "The Bennett farm, I expect," Mrs. Hargrove said. "Grace Bennett has always said there is room in that old cottage if any of us ever needed it. I did not think we would need it quite this soon." Elinor said nothing, but something in her chest loosened slightly at the thought. She had known Grace Bennett for years, had brought baskets of food to her family during the hard winter 2 seasons back, quietly, without asking the Duke's permission, using her own small wages to buy what she could not take from the kitchen stores. She had never expected it to be remembered, let alone returned. Back at the house, the Duke finally moved from where he had been standing. He walked to the window and watched the 4 small figures grow smaller down the long drive, until the oaks swallowed them from view entirely. He told himself this was temporary, a dramatic gesture that would resolve itself by evening, the way small staff disputes always had before. He would send a letter to the placement agency in the city. A new housekeeper could indeed be found by morning, exactly as he had said. He picked up his letter again, the one he had been reading when this had all begun, and tried to find his place in it. He read the same line 4 times before he realized he had not understood a single word of it. Outside, the house had gone entirely silent, the kind of silence that comes not from peace but from absence, and though the Duke did not yet know it, that silence would follow him through every room of Ashcombe Hall for far longer than one single morning. By midday, the kitchen fire had gone cold for the first time in 6 years. By evening, no letter had yet been sent, because the Duke could not bring himself to write it, though he told himself this delay meant nothing at all. And somewhere down a quiet country road, 4 people who had once served in his house were sitting around a small table in a farmhouse kitchen that was not their own, being fed a simple supper by a woman named Grace Bennet who asked no questions and simply set out enough plates for everyone who walked through her door. Eleanor sat at that table with her hands wrapped around a warm cup, and for the first time in 6 years, she did not feel like something waiting to be replaced. She felt instead like something that could not be. The letter to the placement agency was never sent that night, and by the second morning, the Duke understood exactly why he had hesitated. He stood in his own kitchen at 6:30, staring at a cold hearth he did not know how to light. He had never needed to know. For 34 years, someone else had always known for him, had always been awake before him, had always made sure the fire was burning and the kettle was singing before his boots ever touched the floor. Now the kitchen sat dark and silent, the ash from 2 mornings ago still gray and undisturbed in the grate, and Edmund Hale realized, with a discomfort he did not want to name, that he did not know where the matches were kept. He searched 3 drawers before he found them. He knelt at the hearth in his dressing gown, feeling foolish in a way he had not felt since he was a boy, and after several failed attempts, he managed a thin, unsteady flame that caught the kindling and slowly grew. He sat back on his heels and looked at the small fire with something close to pride, until he remembered there was no one left to make the coffee, no one left to prepare the eggs, no one left to do any of the 100 small tasks that had, until 2 days ago, simply happened around him like weather. He ate a piece of dry bread standing at the counter and told himself this was temporary. By mid-morning, a carriage arrived from the placement agency in the city, exactly as he had promised it would. A woman named Constance Whitmore stepped down, credentials in hand, a firm and businesslike smile fixed on her face. She toured the house with the Duke, nodding at the fine furniture, the tall windows, the grand staircase that curved up toward the family portraits. Then she reached the kitchen. She stopped walking. "Your Grace," she said carefully, "may I ask what happened here?" "Nothing happened," the Duke said. "My previous housekeeper left. That is why you are here." Forgive me for saying so, but word travels quickly in the villages nearby. I was told, before I even left the city, that the housekeeper of Ashcombe Hall was dismissed with her entire staff in front of witnesses, and that the words used were rather unkind. "I did not dismiss anyone," the Duke said, his jaw tightening. "They chose to leave. After what was said to them, I understand why they might have." "You were not there." "No," Constance agreed, "but I did not need to be. 3 different households mentioned it to me before I arrived, each one telling it slightly differently, though the ending was always the same. A Duke who called his housekeeper replaceable and a house left with no one to run it." The Duke said nothing. He had not expected the story to travel so far, so fast, carried not by malice but by the simple, unstoppable current of small communities that always know each other's business before they know their own. Constance Whitmore studied him for a long moment. "I will be honest with you, Your Grace, because I believe honesty serves both of us better than flattery. I have 3 housekeepers on my books who might have suited this position. None of the 3 will accept it. I asked each of them personally before making the journey here, and each one gave me the same answer. And what answer was that? That they had heard what was said to Eleanor Marsh, and that they had no wish to work for a man who might say the same to them one day, over a cold cup of tea, in front of people who trusted him. The words landed harder than the Duke expected them to. He turned away from her, walked to the window that looked out over the drive, the same window he had stood at 2 mornings before, watching 4 small figures disappear beneath the oaks. "Then find me someone from further away," he said, "someone who has not heard the story." "I can try," Constance said, though her tone suggested she did not believe it would work. "But, Your Grace, if I may offer something beyond my usual services, a house like this does not run on hired hands alone. Whoever ran your kitchen, your linens, your correspondence, your tenants' accounts, she was not simply staff. From what I am told, she was the reason this house functioned at all." "She was a housekeeper," the Duke said, though the words felt strange in his mouth now, thinner than they had 2 days ago. "Perhaps," Constance said, gathering her gloves, "though I have visited a great many great houses in my career, Your Grace, and I have learned there is a particular kind of quiet that settles into a home when the person truly holding it together has gone. I felt that quiet the moment I walked through your front door." She left within the hour, promising to send word if she found anyone willing to take the post, though her tone made clear she did not expect good news. By the 3rd day, the household's problems had grown from uncomfortable to unmanageable. The linens had not been washed, and the Duke did not know which of the remaining stable hands, hired hastily and unfamiliar with the house, might be trusted to send them to the laundress in the village. The kitchen stores had begun to run low, because no one had thought to order fresh flour or butter, tasks Eleanor had handled so quietly and so consistently that the Duke had never once in 6 years considered how they happened. Worse than the small failures was the letter that arrived on the 3rd afternoon, sealed with the crest of Lord Henry Croft, the Duke's nearest neighbor and oldest friend, confirming a dinner engagement the 2 families had arranged nearly a month earlier. Lord Croft was traveling with his wife and 2 daughters from their estate 2 counties over, a journey of nearly a full day, to dine at Ashcombe Hall on the coming Friday evening. The Duke had entirely forgotten. He found the original invitation in his desk, written in Eleanor's careful hand, the menu already planned in the margins beside it, a note reminding him to have the good silver polished and the west dining room aired out, since it had not been used since winter. She had planned this dinner weeks ago, quietly, the way she planned everything, leaving him nothing to worry about except arriving on time and being pleasant. Now there was no menu being cooked, no silver being polished, no room being aired, and no one in the house who knew how any of it was meant to be done. He called together the small, temporary staff he had managed to hire in the days since, a cook named Winifred Toll who had never worked in a house this large, 2 maids barely older than Alice had been, and a butler named Charles Whitfield who had, until recently, worked for a smaller family 2 villages away, and who looked increasingly uneasy every time the Duke gave an instruction. "We have guests arriving Friday evening," the Duke said, standing in the kitchen that still smelled faintly of dust rather than bread. "A formal dinner, 5 courses at minimum. The west dining room must be ready." Winifred Toll wiped her hands on her apron, looking around the unfamiliar kitchen with open uncertainty. "Your Grace, forgive me, but I do not know where anything is kept in this kitchen. I do not know your family's preferences, nor the dishes your guests are accustomed to. I was told only that I would be cooking simple meals for yourself, not a formal dinner for a lord's family. I am telling you now. With 3 days to prepare, Your Grace, in a kitchen I have never worked in, I cannot promise the meal will be what your guests expect." Charles Whitfield cleared his throat, and the silver. "Your Grace, I do not know where it is stored, nor which pieces are meant to be used for a formal occasion of this kind." The Duke felt something tighten behind his ribs that he did not immediately recognize as fear, because fear was not a feeling he was accustomed to having inside his own home. "Figure it out," he said, more sharply than he intended, and left the kitchen before his voice could betray anything further. That night, alone in his study, he found himself thinking not of the dinner, nor of Lord Croft, nor even of the silver that remained undiscovered somewhere in the depths of his own house, but of Eleanor Marsh's handwriting in the margin of that invitation, small and neat and utterly unbothered, as though a dinner for a lord's family was no more difficult than breakfast for one. He thought of the winter 2 years past, when he had fallen ill for nearly a week, and had woken each morning to find broth already prepared, his fire already lit, his correspondence already sorted, without ever once having to ask. He had thought at the time that this was simply how a well-run house behaved. He had never once considered that a single person was quietly making all of it happen, holding 100 small threads together so that he never had to notice the weight of any of them. He thought, too, of the words he had said over breakfast, delivered so easily, so thoughtlessly, and how strange it was that a sentence which had taken him perhaps 4 seconds to say was now costing him days he did not know how to fill. Friday arrived faster than he was prepared for. By the time Lord Croft's carriage rolled up the long gravel drive in the late afternoon light, the west dining room had been aired but not properly cleaned. The silver had been found but only partially polished, and the meal Winifred Toll had prepared, though earnest, bore little resemblance to anything a lord's family might expect at a formal table. Lord Henry Croft stepped down from his carriage with his wife on his arm and his 2 daughters close behind, his easy smile fading slightly as he took in the house before him. He had visited Ashcombe Hall a dozen times over the years and had never once seen it look anything less than immaculate. "Edmund," he said, shaking the Duke's hand, his eyes moving briefly, almost involuntarily, toward the front steps where a thin layer of dust still sat undisturbed in the corners. "Is everything well?" "Perfectly well," the Duke said. "Come in, please." Dinner did not go as planned. The soup arrived lukewarm. The second course was delayed nearly 20 minutes while Charles Whitfield searched frantically for the correct serving dishes. Lord Croft's youngest daughter, no older than 12, whispered something to her sister about the room smelling faintly of dust rather than the beeswax polish she remembered from visits before, and though she meant no harm by it, the words carried further across the quiet table than she intended. Lady Croft was gracious throughout, complimenting each course regardless of its quality, filling the awkward silences with pleasant conversation about the weather and the roads. But when the meal finally ended and the family gathered their coats for the journey home, Lord Croft pulled the Duke aside on the front steps, out of earshot of the others. "Edmund," he said, his voice low and genuinely concerned rather than unkind, "I have known you since we were boys. I have dined at this table more times than I can count, and I have never once in all those years seen this house run the way it did tonight. What has happened?" The Duke stood in the cool evening air, watching the carriage lanterns being lit for the journey home, and for a long moment he did not answer. "I said something," he finally admitted, "that I should not have said." Lord Croft studied his old friend's face in the fading light. "To the housekeeper. Yes, I had heard something of it, though I did not credit the details until tonight." "You heard correctly, then." "Edmund," Lord Croft's voice softened, the tone of a man speaking not to a duke but to a friend he had known since childhood. "A house like this does not run itself. It never has. You simply never had to see the hands that were running it because they were skilled enough to make the work invisible. That is not a small thing to lose. That is not something you replace with a placement agency and 3 days' notice." The Duke said nothing, because there was nothing he could say that would not sound, even to his own ears, like an excuse. Lord Croft's carriage pulled away down the long drive a few minutes later, the lantern swaying gently in the dark, and the Duke stood alone on his front steps, long after the sound of the wheels had faded into silence. Inside, Winifred Toll was scrubbing pots long after the guests had gone, exhausted and clearly near tears, though she said nothing of it aloud. Charles Whitfield was still searching for where the good silver was meant to be stored, since no one had told him, and no one in the house currently knew. The Duke walked slowly back inside, past the west dining room where the candles had not yet been extinguished, past the family portraits watching him from the walls with their painted, unreadable expressions, and up the wide staircase toward his own quiet rooms. He did not sleep well that night. He kept thinking of Aliner's handwriting in the margin of that invitation, small and neat and certain, and of how completely he had failed, in a single week, to hold together what she had carried for 6 years without ever once asking for thanks. A week after the disastrous dinner, a man named Oliver Grant arrived at Ashcombe Hall carrying a leather satchel full of papers, and he was not smiling. Oliver Grant had served as the estate's accountant for nearly 9 years, though his visits were usually brief and uneventful, a quiet review of ledgers twice a year, a nod of approval, and a departure that took less than an hour. This visit was different from the moment he stepped through the front door. "Your Grace," he said, setting his satchel down on the study desk with a heaviness that suggested it carried more than paper, "I need to speak with you about the tenant accounts." "What of them?" "I have spent the last 3 days reviewing the ledgers, since your letter mentioned some confusion in the household. I found something I do not fully understand, and I believe you should see it yourself." He opened the satchel and began laying out pages across the desk, each one covered in the same neat, careful handwriting the Duke now recognized instantly. "These are records of payments," Oliver said, "made monthly for the past 2 years to several of your tenant families. Small amounts, nothing that would draw attention on their own, but consistent, and always timed to arrive just before the quarterly rents were due." The Duke frowned, leaning over the pages. "Payments from whom?" "That is what confused me, Your Grace. The official estate accounts show no record of these payments being authorized by you. But the household accounts, the smaller ledger kept for daily kitchen expenses and staff wages, show regular withdrawals matching these exact amounts, always recorded under the same simple notation." He pointed to a line near the bottom of one page. "Household necessities," the Duke read aloud. "Yes, for 2 years, Your Grace, someone in this house has been quietly taking a portion of the household budget, small enough never to be questioned, and using it to help certain tenant families through difficult seasons. The Bennett family, after the fever that took their eldest son. The Coopers, after their barn burned 2 winters past. Even old Mr. Fenwick, whose harvest failed twice in a row, and who, I am told, was quietly forgiven half his rent for an entire year, though there is no official record of that forgiveness anywhere in the estate books." The Duke sat down slowly in his chair, staring at the pages spread across his desk, each one a small, careful act of kindness that had been happening under his own roof for years without his knowledge. "Whose handwriting is this?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "Aliner Marsh's, Your Grace. I would recognize it anywhere. She has kept these household books for 6 years, and I have never once found an error in them, not before this and not now. Every payment is accounted for. Every withdrawal is matched precisely to a need. She simply never told you, and I confess, Your Grace, I never thought to ask why the household budget always ran slightly lower than similar estates of this size. I assumed it was simply good management." "It was," the Duke said quietly. "It was good management. It was also 6 years of decisions I never knew were being made in my name." Oliver Grant gathered the pages back into a neat stack, his expression careful and diplomatic. "I do not say this to trouble you further, Your Grace, but the tenants who received this help do not know the payments have stopped. The quarterly rents are due again in 3 weeks. If the households that have come to rely on this quiet assistance do not receive it this season, Several of them may fall behind for the first time in years. The Duke sat with that information for a long moment, staring at the careful handwriting that had, without his knowledge, been holding together not just his household but a small web of families across his land who depended on a kindness he had never once authorized and never once thanked her for. "Leave the ledgers with me," he said finally. Oliver Grant hesitated at the door. "Your Grace, if I may say one more thing. I have worked with a great many estates over the years, some far larger than yours. I have rarely seen a household manage its resources with the care Eleanor Marsh showed in these books. Whatever was said to cause her to leave, I hope you understand what was lost with her." He left the ledgers on the desk and showed himself out, and the Duke sat alone in his study, long after the sound of the accountant's carriage had faded down the drive. He spent that evening reading through 2 years of small, careful entries, each one a quiet story he had never known was happening in his own house. A widow given extra flour during a hard month. A family's roof repaired using materials bought quietly through the estate's own supplier, the cost hidden inside a larger order so no one would question it. Children's shoes, bought new each autumn for families who could not otherwise afford them, listed simply as household necessities, so that no tenant would ever have to feel the shame of charity. By the time he closed the last ledger, the candles in his study had burned low, and something in his chest had shifted that he did not entirely understand yet. The next morning he called for his horse. He did not tell Charles Whitfield or Winifred Toll where he was going. He rode out alone, following the road that wound past the edges of his own land, past fields he had ridden through 100 times without ever truly looking at the people working them. His first stop was the Fenwick farm, a small, weathered property at the edge of the estate. Old Mr. Fenwick was in the yard when the Duke arrived, mending a fence post, and he straightened up slowly at the sight of the horse and rider approaching. "Your Grace," he said, wiping his hands on his trousers, his tone careful and slightly wary. Dukes did not usually ride out to visit tenant farms uninvited. "Mr. Fenwick," the Duke said, dismounting, "I understand your rent was forgiven this past year and the year before. I would like to ask you about that." The old man's face went still. "I don't rightly know what you mean, Your Grace. I've paid my rent same as anyone." "You do not need to protect anyone, Mr. Fenwick. I have seen the ledgers. I know it was Eleanor Marsh who arranged it. I am not here to punish you for accepting help, nor to punish her for offering it. I only want to understand." Fenwick was quiet for a long moment, studying the Duke's face as though trying to decide whether this was some kind of trap. Finally, he set down his hammer. "2 harvests failed in a row, Your Grace. First the blight, then the flooding. I was ready to sell what little I had left and move my family into town, find whatever work I could. Miss Marsh came out here herself, on a Sunday, her one day free from the house. Said she'd heard about the harvest from one of your other tenants, and that the estate had decided to forgive my rent that year, seeing as the failure wasn't any fault of mine. Said it was simply how a well-run estate treated hardship." "There was no such decision," the Duke said quietly. "Not one that I made." Fenwick's eyes widened slightly, understanding dawning on his weathered face. "She said it came from you, Your Grace. She never once said different." "She let you believe it came from me." "She did." Fenwick paused, choosing his next words carefully. "I always thought it strange, if I'm honest, that a duke would trouble himself with an old farmer's failed harvest. But Miss Marsh, she had a way of speaking that made you believe things without ever quite lying to you outright. I see now what she must have done." The Duke stood in the farmyard for a long moment, the morning sun warm on his shoulders, absorbing what he had just learned. Eleanor had not merely managed his household. She had, quietly and without any credit to herself, been managing his reputation among the very people whose loyalty and livelihood depended on him, protecting families from hardship using his name, while never once telling him she was doing it, and never once asking for thanks. "I am sorry, Mr. Fenwick," he said finally. for not knowing sooner what was happening on my own land. No need to apologize to me, Your Grace. Seems to me the person you owe an apology to isn't standing in this yard. The Duke rode on that afternoon to the Cooper farm, where he learned much the same story. A barn rebuilt using materials quietly diverted through the estate's accounts, arranged entirely by a leaner, credited entirely to him. He rode past the small cottage where the widow Ashworth lived alone, and learned that she had received firewood every winter for 3 years running, delivered anonymously, though everyone in the village had long assumed it came from the Duke's own generosity. By the time he turned his horse back toward Ashcombe Hall in the fading afternoon light, he understood something he had not understood a week before. He had believed, when he said those careless words over breakfast, that Eleanor Marsh was simply a woman who managed his household, someone whose absence would inconvenience him for a few days until a replacement could be found. He understood now that she had been quietly weaving together an entire community's trust in him, thread by careful thread, for 6 years, and he had unraveled it in 4 seconds without even noticing the size of what he was cutting. That evening he sat again at his desk, staring at the ledgers, and found himself thinking of something Lord Croft had said on the front steps a week ago. A house like this does not run itself. He had thought at the time that his friend meant only the practical matters, the meals and the linens and the polished silver. He understood now that Lord Croft had meant something far larger, something that reached out past the walls of Ashcombe Hall and touched every family whose lives were bound to his land. He thought, too, of his own father long past, who had once told him that a title was not a thing a man earned but a thing he was simply given, and that the only way to deserve it was to spend a lifetime trying to be worthy of what had been handed to him. Edmund had always thought he understood that lesson. He was beginning to suspect, sitting alone in his study with 2 years of quiet, careful kindness spread across his desk, that he had never understood it at all. The following morning, he sent word to the village that the quarterly rents due in 3 weeks would be adjusted for any tenant family who had suffered hardship in the past season, and that any family in need of assistance should come speak with him directly, in person, rather than waiting for help to arrive quietly through channels he no longer had access to. It was, he knew, a clumsy and incomplete attempt to continue something he did not fully know how to continue, but it was the only thing he could think to do. That same afternoon, Charles Whitfield knocked carefully on the study door. "Your Grace, forgive the intrusion. A letter arrived for you from the placement agency in the city." The Duke took the letter and read it slowly. Constance Whitmore had written to inform him, with careful and professional regret, that she had been unable to find any housekeeper willing to accept the position at Ashcombe Hall, not within the county, and not within the neighboring counties either. The story, she wrote, had traveled further than either of them had expected, carried by servants moving between households, by tradesmen delivering goods, by the simple, unstoppable gossip of small communities that remembered everything and forgot nothing. She closed the letter with a single line that the Duke read 3 times before setting the page down. "I have found in my years of this work that reputation is the one thing money cannot quickly repair. Perhaps, Your Grace, the person you are looking for was never meant to be replaced by an agency at all." The Duke sat with the letter in his hands for a long time after reading it, the evening light fading slowly outside his window, and for the first time since that morning over breakfast tea, he allowed himself to fully consider what he had actually lost, and what, if anything, might still be done to find his way back to it. He thought of Eleanor's small, careful handwriting in the margins of 2 years of ledgers. He thought of Mr. Fenwick's weathered face in the farmyard, and the quiet dignity of a man who had never known he was accepting charity, disguised as a decision from a duke who had never made it. He thought of the widow Ashworth's firewood, and the Cooper family's rebuilt barn, and 100 small kindnesses stitched together so carefully that no one, not even the man whose name was attached to them, had ever noticed the size of the work being done. He did not yet know where Eleanor Marsh had gone, though he suspected, from something Mrs. Hargrove had once mentioned in passing years ago, that the Bennet family's farm might hold the answer. He did not yet know what he would say to her if he found her, after the words he had already said and could never take back. But he knew, sitting alone in his study as the last light faded from the sky, that he could not simply wait for morning and hope a stranger would arrive to fill a place that had never truly belonged to a stranger at all. The Bennet farm sat at the far edge of the county, past a stretch of road the Duke had never once traveled in all his years at Ashcombe Hall, though it belonged, technically, to land his family had owned for 3 generations. He rode there on a gray morning, the sky heavy with clouds that had not yet decided whether to release their rain, and he told himself the entire way that he was simply going to speak with Eleanor Marsh about the tenant accounts, a practical conversation about ledgers and household necessities, nothing more. He did not entirely believe himself, but it was the only story he could tell that made the ride feel bearable. The farmhouse came into view as he crested a small hill, a modest stone building with smoke curling from its chimney, chickens moving lazily across a fenced yard, and beyond it, a small cottage he did not recognize, clearly newer than the main house, built from timber that had not yet weathered to gray. As he drew closer, he saw figures moving in the yard between the 2 buildings. A woman hanging linens on a line, her sleeves rolled to her elbows. A young man carrying water buckets from a well toward a trough where 2 horses waited. A younger girl scattering feed for the chickens, laughing at something the man had said. The Duke recognized all 3 of them before he was close enough to see their faces clearly. Mrs. Hargrove was the first to notice him. She straightened from the washing line slowly, a wet sheet still gripped in both hands, and her expression did not soften the way it once had when he approached. "Your Grace," she said, her voice carefully neutral, the sheet dripping quietly onto the grass between them. "This is not a visit I expected." "Mrs. Hargrove." He dismounted, holding his horse's reins loosely, suddenly unsure what to do with his hands. "I am here to speak with Eleanor." Peter Doyle set down his water buckets and crossed his arms, saying nothing, though his silence carried its own clear message. Alice Finch had stopped scattering feed and stood very still near the chicken coop, watching the exchange with wide, uncertain eyes. "She is inside," Mrs. Hargrove said finally, "though I cannot promise she will wish to see you." "I understand." "I am not certain that you do, Your Grace, but you are welcome to try." The Duke walked toward the cottage, aware of 3 sets of eyes following him across the yard, aware, too, of how strange it felt to walk somewhere on his own land as though he were the visitor and they were the ones who belonged. He knocked on the cottage door, and for a long moment there was no answer at all. Then the door opened, and Eleanor Marsh stood in the doorway. She looked different than she had at Ashcombe Hall, though the Duke could not immediately say how. Perhaps it was simply the absence of the uniform, the plain gray dress replaced by a simple work dress the color of autumn wheat. Perhaps it was the way she stood, not with the careful, contained posture of a woman managing a household she did not own, but with the straight, unhurried ease of someone standing in a doorway that belonged to her. "Your Grace," she said, and her voice held none of the warmth it once carried when she greeted him at his own front door, though it held no fear either. "I did not expect to see you here. I need to speak with you. About the household accounts, I assume. Mr. Grant mentioned he had gone through the ledgers." "Yes and no." He hesitated, suddenly aware that every sentence he had planned on the ride over now felt hollow and small standing in front of her. "May I come in?" Eleanor studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable, before stepping back from the door. The cottage was small but warm, a single main room with a fireplace, a rough wooden table, 2 chairs, and a narrow staircase leading up to what he assumed were sleeping quarters above. It was nothing like the grand halls of Ashcombe, and yet there was something in it, some quality of quiet order that reminded him instantly of the house he had left that morning. "Sit if you like," Elinor said, though she did not sit herself, choosing instead to stand near the window with her arms folded. The Duke remained standing as well, unwilling to sit while she did not. "I visited Mr. Fenwick," he said, "and the Coopers, and I learned about the widow Ashworth's firewood." Something shifted in Elinor's expression, though it was gone almost as quickly as it appeared. "I see. You never told me." "No," she agreed, "I did not." "Why not?" Elinor turned to look out the window, watching Peter and Alice moving in the yard below. "Because you would have said no, Your Grace. Not out of cruelty, but out of habit. You were taught to see the estate as a set of accounts to be balanced, not as families who depended on you for more than rent collection. I did not wish to argue with you over every small kindness. It was simpler to arrange it quietly and let you believe the estate was simply well managed. You let Mr. Fenwick believe I had personally forgiven his rent." "I did." She turned back to face him, and there was no apology in her expression. "Because it was easier for him to accept help he believed came from his Duke's understanding, rather than charity arranged in secret by a housekeeper. I was protecting his dignity, Your Grace, and yours, whether you wished to be protected or not." The Duke absorbed this in silence, understanding, not for the first time in the past 2 weeks, how much of his own life had been quietly arranged around him by a woman he had called replaceable over a cup of cooling tea. "I came here to say I am sorry," he said finally. "For what I said, for how I said it, for saying it in front of everyone as though your 6 years of work and Mrs. Hargrove's 11 years and Alice's trust and Peter's loyalty meant nothing at all." "An apology is a start, Your Grace," Elinor said, her voice steady. "But it does not undo what was said nor what it revealed." "What did it reveal?" "That you believed in your heart that anyone who works for you can simply be swapped out like a broken tool, without cost, without consequence, without a single thought given to what they built while they were there. Perhaps you did not consciously believe it before that morning, but the words came so easily to you, Your Grace, so quickly, that I do not think they were new thoughts. I think they were old ones, finally spoken aloud." The Duke felt the truth of this land somewhere deep in his chest, uncomfortable and undeniable. "You are right," he said quietly. "I did not think of you as someone who could be lost. I thought of you as someone who would always simply be there, managing everything, so quietly that I never had to consider what it would mean if you were not. And now I have spent 2 weeks discovering exactly what it means. The kitchen fire that will not light itself. The dinner that fell apart in front of Lord Croft's family. The tenants whose trust I did not even know I was borrowing from you. I have learned, Elinor, in the clumsiest and most humiliating way possible, that I was never running Ashcombe Hall at all. You were. I simply lived inside what you built and called it my own." Elinor said nothing for a long moment, watching him with an expression that had softened only slightly, though her arms remained folded, a small, deliberate distance still held between them. "What do you want from me, Your Grace?" It was the question the Duke had been avoiding since he mounted his horse that morning, and he found, standing in her small cottage with the fire crackling quietly beside them, that he did not have a simple answer prepared. "I do not know that I have the right to ask for anything," he said slowly. "I do not expect you to return to Ashcombe Hall as though nothing happened. I do not expect an apology to repair 6 years of being taken for granted. I only wanted you to know that I understand now fully what I lost, and that I am sorry it took losing it to understand it at all." "That is not nothing," Elinor said quietly, "but it is also not enough." "Then tell me what would be enough." Elinor was silent for a long moment, and outside, the Duke could hear Peter's voice calling something to Alice, followed by her light, easy laughter carrying across the yard. It was a sound, he realized, that had not existed inside the walls of Ashcombe Hall in longer than he could remember, not because his staff had been unhappy there, but because a house run entirely on quiet obligation rarely made room for laughter at all. "I am not certain there is an answer I can give you today, Your Grace," Elinor said finally. "Trust is not repaired with a single visit, however sincere. It is repaired slowly, through actions sustained over time, long after the apology has been forgotten. If you wish to earn something back, it will not happen this afternoon, and it will not happen because you rode here on a gray morning and said the right words in my doorway." "Then I will come back," the Duke said, "as many times as it takes. You may find that riding out here is easier than the work that would actually change anything. Tell me what that work looks like, and I will do it." Elinor studied him for a long moment, as though weighing whether the man standing in her doorway was truly different from the one who had spoken those careless words 2 weeks before, or whether he simply wished, in this moment, to believe he was. "Come back tomorrow," she said finally. "Not to speak with me. Come to the Fenwick farm. His fence needs mending before the winter, and his hands are not what they once were. If you truly wish to understand what was carried on your behalf for 6 years, Your Grace, you might begin by carrying something yourself." The Duke had not expected this answer, and for a moment he did not know how to respond to it. He had imagined, if he imagined anything at all on the ride over, that earning Elinor's forgiveness might involve grand gestures, formal letters, perhaps even a public correction of the words he had spoken so carelessly. He had not imagined mending fences. "I will be there," he said. "We will see, Your Grace." He left the cottage a few minutes later, walking back across the yard beneath a sky that had finally begun to release a thin, cold rain. Mrs. Hargrove watched him go with an expression that had not entirely softened, though it had lost some of its earlier wariness. Peter gave him a short nod, more acknowledgement than approval. Alice did not look at him at all, focused instead on gathering the last of the wet linens before the rain grew heavier. The Duke rode back toward Ashcombe Hall through the rain, soaked through by the time the house came into view through the gray afternoon light. And for the first time since that morning over breakfast tea, he did not feel like a man returning to something he owned. He felt instead like a man beginning something he had not yet earned the right to call his own again. And though the road ahead of him remained uncertain, he understood, finally, that the answer would not be found by waiting for morning and hopping. A replacement might arrive to fix what 4 careless words had broken. It would be found, if it was found at all, one mended fence, one honest conversation, one small and unglamorous act at a time. The Duke arrived at the Fenwick farm the next morning before the sun had fully cleared the tree line, dressed not in his usual fine coat, but in plain work clothes he had found buried in the back of an old wardrobe, clothes he could not even remember buying, though someone, at some point, must have thought to prepare them for a purpose he had never once used them for. Old Mr. Fenwick was already in the yard when he arrived, leaning against the half-mended fence with a mug of something warm in his hands, and he looked at the Duke with an expression somewhere between surprise and quiet amusement. "Did not truly believe you'd come, Your Grace, if I'm honest with you. I said I would." "Plenty of men say plenty of things," Fenwick said, though there was no bitterness in it, only the plain observation of a man who had lived long enough to know the difference between words and actions. "Fence posts are round the side. Mind the nettles, they've grown thick this year." The work was harder than the Duke expected. He had ridden horses his entire life, had walked his own fields on inspection tour, had even, as a young boy, occasionally helped with small tasks under the watchful eye of his father, who believed a future duke should understand the land he would one day be responsible for. But he had never done real labor, not the kind that left his palms raw within the first hour, not the kind that made his back ache in ways he had never experienced sitting at a desk reviewing ledgers. He worked through the morning in near silence, digging post holes, hauling timber, following Fenwick's patient instructions on how to set each post so it would hold through the coming winter storms. By midday, his hands had begun to blister, and he found himself grateful, in a strange and unfamiliar way, for the physical ache of it, because it gave him something simple to think about other than the 2 weeks of quiet unraveling that had brought him here. "You're doing better than I expected," Fenwick admitted, watching the Duke set another post with careful, deliberate effort. "Though your hands'll be paying for it tomorrow." "They already are today." Fenwick laughed, a short, genuine sound. "That they will. Miss Marsh, when she used to come help my Sarah with the harvest some years, she'd say the same thing every time. Complained about her hands something fierce, though she never once stopped coming back the next season." The Duke paused, a post half set in the ground. "She helped with the harvest every autumn for years on her one free Sunday. Said it reminded her of home, growing up. Never made much of it mind. Just showed up, worked till dusk, and went back to the house without asking for a word of thanks." The Duke said nothing, simply returned to his work. Though something in his chest had tightened at the thought of 6 years of Sundays he had never once known were being spent this way. He returned to the Fenwick farm again the following week, and the week after that, and slowly, without quite planning it, the visits became something he did not need reminding to do. He mended fences. He helped repair a section of the Cooper family's barn roof that had begun to sag again after the rebuilding. He split firewood for the widow Ashworth, stacking it neatly against her cottage wall while she watched from her window with an expression of careful, cautious surprise. He did not tell any of them why he was doing it, and none of them asked directly, though word traveled through the small community the way it always did, quietly and thoroughly, until every family on his land knew that the Duke of Ashcombe had taken to working alongside his tenants with his own 2 hands. Back at Ashcombe Hall, the household continued its slow and difficult reconstruction. Winifred Toll, given time and patience rather than panic, began to find her footing in the kitchen, and though her cooking never quite matched the quiet excellence Alina had once brought to the household without ever being asked, it improved steadily, meal by meal. Charles Whitfield eventually located the good silver, tucked away in a cabinet no one had thought to check, and slowly learned the rhythms of a house far larger than any he had managed before. The Duke found himself, in the evenings, doing something he had never once done in his 34 years at Ashcombe Hall. He began learning the house himself, not through inspection tour or ledger reviews, but through simple, direct participation. He learned where the linens were stored and how they were meant to be folded. He learned which fireplaces drew well and which required extra kindling on damp mornings. He learned, slowly and often clumsily, the 100 small tasks that had once simply happened around him, invisible and effortless, because one woman had spent 6 years making certain they always did. 3 weeks after his first visit to the Fenwick farm, he rode out again to the Bennett property, though this time he did not go directly to Alina's cottage. Instead, he found Mrs. Hargrove in the farmhouse kitchen, kneading bread with the same careful, practiced hands that had once run his own kitchen for 11 years. "Your Grace," she said, not stopping her work, though her tone had warmed slightly since his last visit. "Come to mend more fences." "Have you?" "I came to ask if you might consider returning to Ashcombe Hall." Mrs. Hargrove's hands stilled briefly before resuming their steady rhythm. "That is a large question, Your Grace, for a man standing in someone else's kitchen." "I know it is. I'm not asking you to answer today. I'm only asking you to consider it when you feel ready, if you ever do. The house is not the same without you. I do not simply mean the practical matters, though those are difficult enough. I mean that the house has felt, since you left, like a place rather than a home, and I understand now that the difference between those 2 things was never something I created myself." Mrs. Hargrove was quiet for a long moment, studying his face with the same sharp, appraising look she had once given him over 11 years of managing his household affairs. "You have changed something, Your Grace, these past weeks. I will not pretend I have not noticed it, nor that the whole county has not noticed it as well. But changing yourself is not the same as earning back what was lost. That takes longer than a few weeks of mended fences, however sincere they may be. I understand that. Do you? She set down the dough, wiping her hands on her apron, and looked at him directly. Alina spent 6 years of her life making certain that house never once looked broken to the outside world, and it cost her more than you ever knew, Your Grace, more than I think you know even now. She smoothed over your father's temper before you, and yours after him, and she did it so quietly and so well that neither of you ever had to see the cost of it. If you wish for any of us to return, it cannot be to the same house, with the same understanding, that we left 3 weeks ago. It must be something different, something that does not require a woman to disappear herself entirely just to keep it running smoothly. The Duke absorbed this in silence, understanding, with a clarity that had been slowly building over the past weeks, that what Mrs. Hargrove was describing was not merely a request but a warning, and a fair one. "Then tell me what needs to change," he said. "Beyond the fence posts and the firewood, what would make Ashcombe Hall a place worth returning to?" Mrs. Hargrove studied him for a long moment before answering. "A house where the people running it are seen, Your Grace, not simply relied upon. A house where a woman is not expected to arrange charity in secret, because her employer cannot be trusted to approve it openly. A house where 6 years of loyalty is not erased by 4 careless words over breakfast tea, because the man saying them never once stopped to consider what he might be losing." "I cannot undo those 4 words." "No," she agreed, "you cannot, but you can spend the years ahead making certain they were the last careless words of that kind you ever speak." The Duke left the Bennet farm that afternoon without having seen Alina at all, though he did not mind it, understanding now that his path back to Ashcombe Hall's true restoration ran through more than one doorway, and that Alina's forgiveness, if it came at all, would come only after the rest of it had been earned first. Autumn deepened into winter over the following weeks. The Duke continued his visits to the tenant farms, no longer out of guilt alone, but because he had come, slowly and somewhat to his own surprise, to genuinely value the work and the people he was doing it alongside. He learned Mr. Fenwick's stories about the land, stretching back 3 generations. He learned the names of the Cooper children, 5 of them, each one curious about the strange sight of a duke covered in barn dust. He learned from the widow Ashworth about her late husband, who had once worked the Ashcombe stables himself, decades before the Duke was born. At Ashcombe Hall, the household slowly found its rhythm again, imperfect but genuine, built now on the Duke's direct involvement rather than his complete absence from its daily workings. He began reviewing the household accounts personally each week, no longer content to let the details happen invisibly around him. He began, too, quietly authorizing the kind of assistance Alina had once arranged in secret, openly now, discussed directly with the tenant families rather than hidden behind careful ledger notations. Word of this, too, traveled through the county, carried the same way the story of his careless words once had, though this time the story carried a different shape entirely. It was nearly 2 months after that first breakfast, on a cold morning in early winter, that Mrs. Hargrove returned to Ashcombe Hall, walking up the same long gravel drive she had walked down 2 months before, though this time she came alone, and this time she came by her own choosing rather than in solidarity with anyone else's departure. "I am not promising anything permanent, Your Grace," she said, standing in the front hall with her small case in hand. "I am simply willing to see whether the house you are building now is one worth staying in." "That is more than I hoped for," the Duke said. "Thank you, Margaret." It was the first time in 11 years he had used her given name rather than her title, and something in her expression softened slightly at hearing it. Alice Finch returned 2 weeks after that, drawn back not by any grand gesture, but by a simple, handwritten letter the Duke sent to the Bennet farm, apologizing directly to her for the first time, acknowledging that his careless words had cost a 17-year-old girl her first position away from home, and that she deserved better than to have learned, on her very first post, that loyalty could be dismissed so casually. Peter Doyle took the longest to return, and when he finally did, in the deep cold of midwinter, it was not for the Duke at all, but because the Ashcombe stables held horses he had grown attached to over the years, and because Mrs. Hargrove had mentioned, in passing, that the Duke had been mucking out the stalls himself in the meantime badly, and someone needed to save the poor animals from his efforts. Eleanor Marsh did not return that winter, nor the following spring. She remained at the Bennett farm, where Grace Bennett had come to depend on her help with the growing farm accounts, and where, slowly, Eleanor had begun teaching Alice's younger sister and 2 other village children their letters in the evenings, a small school forming out of nothing more than a spare room and Eleanor's quiet, patient insistence that every child deserved to read. The Duke visited occasionally, though never to ask her again to return, understanding now that the asking itself had never been the point. He visited instead to help repair the schoolroom's leaking roof one autumn afternoon, and to deliver, unprompted and without any note attached, a crate of proper slates and chalk for the children's lessons, purchased with his own money and delivered by his own hand, rather than arranged quietly through household accounts. Eleanor watched him unload the crate from his cart one gray afternoon nearly a year after that first breakfast, and for the first time since the morning he had called her replaceable, something that might have been the beginning of a genuine smile crossed her face. "You did not have to bring these yourself, Your Grace," she said. "You could have sent someone." "I know," he said. "I wanted to bring them myself." "Why?" "Because I spent 6 years letting someone else carry every good thing that happened in my name, without ever once understanding the weight of it or thanking the person carrying it. I do not intend to make that mistake again, with you or with anyone else." Eleanor studied him for a long moment, the same careful, appraising look she had given him in her cottage doorway nearly a year before, though something in it had shifted now, softened by months of steady, unglamorous effort that had asked nothing of her in return. "Perhaps," she said finally, "there is hope for Ashcombe Hall yet." "Perhaps," the Duke agreed, "there always was. I simply never noticed the work it took to keep it standing." He did not ask her to return that day, nor the next, understanding now that some things could not be hurried back into place, however sincerely a man wished them to be. But the following winter, nearly 2 years after that first cold morning when he had knelt at an unfamiliar hearth in his own kitchen, fumbling with matches he did not know the location of, the Duke rose before dawn as he had slowly come to do most mornings, walked down to the kitchen of Ashcombe Hall while the rest of the household still slept, and knelt at the same hearth to build the morning fire with hands that no longer felt clumsy or unfamiliar with the task. He struck the match on the first try. The flame caught the kindling easily, grew steady and warm in the gray pre-dawn light. And as he sat back on his heels watching it burn, he understood, finally and completely, that a house was never truly built from stone and title alone. It was built, morning after morning, fire after fire, from the quiet, unglamorous work of people who chose, again and again, to show up for it. He had lost that once, in 4 careless words over a cooling cup of tea. He did not intend to lose it again. Outside, the sun was beginning to rise over the fields where the Fenwick farm and the Cooper farm and the widow Ashworth's small cottage all sat quiet under a fresh layer of winter frost, and somewhere down the long road past the Oaks, in a farmhouse kitchen not his own, a woman named Eleanor Marsh was rising too, to teach a room full of children their letters, in a life she had built entirely for herself, needing no one's permission to be exactly as valuable as she had always been.